I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. Today we have a very special guest with us, Daniel Wagner. He is a pioneering figure in global education, literacy, and international development. As the UNESCO Chair in Learning and Literacy and the founding director of both the International Literacy Institute and the National Center on Adult Literacy, he has dedicated his life to advancing educational equity in undeserved communities worldwide. His work spans 6 continents and bridges developmental psychology, education policy, and technological innovation. With over 4 decades of leadership in research and policy advising, his work has shaped the global conversation on what it means to learn and teach across vastly different cultural and economic contexts. I am so excited for today's conversation. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Great to be with you, Gautam.
Yeah, I mean, this type of work, it's something I've been thinking a lot. I mean, I recently just turned 28, and I feel like just over the span of the last few years, through this podcast and through some of the other work that I do, I feel like my ideas have shifted so much just from the types of different perspectives that I get to hear. And so sometimes I get to I'm just so in awe with people who've been able to be in a space for decades and just to be able to hear what are the things that they've learned, how did they start. And so I feel like the best place to always start is with origin stories, but I'd love to know how you became really fascinated first with education and then the international component, I guess, next.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the way you laid it out, and I too am fascinated by not just personal biography, but by history and how it intersects with the work that we do and how we happen to do it. I've had a lot of students over the years and had an opportunity to sort of watch their trajectories, personal and professional. In my own case, as you may have seen, I started out, my origin story is maybe a little peculiar in that I started out because I come from a family where 2 generations had worked in the area of electrical engineering at the beginning of that field. I had an early opportunity as a kid to pal around with my father and grandfather, helping to rebuild motors and trying to understand how electricity worked. That was sort of, my grandfather was at the front end of that, and my father continued after him. And I was supposed to do the same. I was enrolled at Cornell University as an engineer, thinking I would be either an electrical engineer or something like that. We were just beginning, as I started taking classes, became aware of the, believe it or not, the transistor radio. This is post-World War II, and also the beginning of computers, which eventually I ended up having a degree in what became computer engineering, had a different name then. But during that time, it was the 1960s, and I had this sense that if I did engineering, I would be learning more of the same that I got as a kid. So apropos of your your first comment, how do you get to do the work you're doing? I thought, halfway through my engineering degree, I better learn something else before I get out of college. So I took a few courses in psychology, just for fun. And I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. Maybe there's something to this thing called social sciences. And I was fortunate. I had a couple of good teachers and teachers who thought that maybe I could do something useful in psychology. But before I could do the psychology, I had applied to graduate school. I got into some very good schools, thanks to good references from my undergraduate instructors. And so I ended up going into the Peace Corps, as you already know. But the interesting thing about that is I could use my engineering in Peace Corps. They had an opening for rural irrigation engineers in Morocco. And it's sort of a interesting, too long a story to relate here, but I ended up doing that. And so I went to Morocco back in the late 60s as an engineer and designing small canals, small dams, helping rural agriculture in the mountains of Morocco. It was a unique opportunity. Very few Peace Corps people actually get out of a city to work in the countryside and live in a home made of mud walls and no electricity, speaking of electricity. And so it was a fascinating experience living with mainly people who were quite rural, who'd never gone to school, whose children were just beginning to go to school. And I say that because even though my work was as an engineer, I was looking around me and seeing what was going on. This was a time when you were in a rural area, you were really rural, sort of like you might imagine in the old days in many low-income countries where difficult to find running water, lack of electricity, schools were just being built, many children not in school, and most of the youth and adults never having gone to school. So I absorbed that and then went to graduate school in psychology. And I went to the University of Michigan. At that point, I was in what was called in those days, I guess still is, experimental psychology, where you learned how to do experiments on human subjects, usually college sophomores. I found that experience to be exceedingly dull. My teachers were brilliant, but I just could not. I had that kind of experience that some people do when they've been abroad and then they go back home and they say, I'm not sure that this is exactly what I want to be doing. And so I was very fortunate, found some professors who had a larger view on the world and gave me more or less the freedom to carve out my own trajectory. And that trajectory is still ongoing now. It isn't like I decided on one thing and I've been doing it my whole career. Quite the contrary. So I'll just give you a few stepping stones without taking more time because I know we have other issues. But those stepping stones went from experimental psychology to what we now call child or developmental psychology, then to educational psychology, then to education with a cultural interest, then to education and development with a broader social science and anthropology interest, and then to working with the United Nations in various of its specialized organizations like UNICEF and UNESCO and the World Bank. At the same time, running in parallel, I was a young professor at the University of Pennsylvania, teaching in the Graduate School of Education, students from different backgrounds and departments trying to learn about how children learn. That was a theme that runs through my work. Eventually, and I think one of the important stepping stone that's sort of parallel to what I've described, I could have done all of this, and at the beginning I did as a researcher, as a university researcher, paying my dues and teaching and publishing in an area of expertise. But over this time period, even happening fairly quickly, I became interested in the idea of making a difference outside of the classroom, making a difference outside of the university. And then, as my career developed, realizing that there was a stepping stone that was missing for me. And that stepping stone was paying attention to why it is so difficult to help the poorest people, the most disadvantaged, those people that I saw in Morocco every day. But I realized, having then gone back to Morocco later, and we could talk about those stories, but realizing that most of the kind of work people doing never made it really to the rural kids, never made it to the rural communities. And to the extent that they did, it was very difficult to implement, very difficult to achieve the kind of goals that many of us wanted to achieve. And so now, by the time I am considerably older and a senior person in the field, I'm still committed to this idea that it's not easy to make a difference, and you can be highly skilled as a researcher, you can have a strong reputation and publish books and so on and so forth, but to get the actual work done on the ground is quite a challenge. And I've been working at that for a while. So that's my stepping stones, a little bit of personal history.
Thanks for laying that out. I mean, I took so many notes. I have so many things to ask you. I mean, I guess maybe one place that we can start, as you laid that stepping stones up, you talked about development and your work that kind of existed in that space. In one of the book clubs that I run, we've been reading this super interesting book about this small community in Korea, in an island in Korea, And I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos about this particular group of women divers, and it's been
Yes, I
so
know about
interesting.
it. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
been so interesting to learn about them. I think the book name is The Sea of Women, or The
yeah,
Woman of the Sea.
yeah,
It's been a
yeah, yeah.
phenomenal book. And I've been, learning about different parts of their culture, and I've been watching videos. I've kind of been going on these rabbit holes where I've been learning about more tribal communities around the world. And it's sometimes so stark to see the differences, especially through video, in the quality of life, in the sense of the access to, healthcare, their understanding of the world through modern science, I guess, in a lot of different ways. And I wanted to understand, when we use this word development,
Yeah.
what do we really mean by that? What does it mean for one society or group of people to quote unquote be developed?
Right. I'm glad you put quotes around that because I don't really believe in that singular word. In fact, you may know this is time for a local announcement. So the second edition of my book just came out, and it's called Learning as Development. But the first chapter is, what do we mean by development? And I don't mean to make this into a focus necessarily on the book itself, but just to say that term means a lot of different things to different people and has historically meant different things to different people. I wanted to make sure at the beginning of our conversation that I laid out again the sort of historical perspective, which in fact you just did a little bit when you talked about the sort of historical situation in that island in Korea. Of course, there are islands similar to Korea all over the world, right? We're all Koreans in that sense. We all grow up and we live in the context which is available to us, and sometimes we get out of it, sometimes we stay in it. So development, if you look at the first couple chapters of my book, is used in two very different ways in the work that I do. I also want to say there are other ways as well, but development in the sense that we are talking about it and that you raised is this idea of international development. It's a term that was largely owned, so to speak, after World War II, largely by the World Bank and the United Nations, as meaning economic development. That was the sense. We could talk about that for a while. But well before that, as you know, coming historically from India, there was a development all around the world hundreds of years before that the colonizers said was civilizing development. Everybody should be British or speak English or be Catholic or be something else. So this notion of development has been owned, so to speak, by different powers that be over quite a long time. Viewed historically, today we view that in many ways negatively because of what happened through colonialism. But at the time it was taking place, people felt they were doing, or they said they felt they were doing the right thing. And part of that right thing, by the way, was promoting schooling, especially the British, but also the French and the other colonizers to a lesser extent. So when you ask me the question, what is development, if we're taking it through an education lens, then we actually have to start earlier than the sort of official beginning after World War II. I might add, and this is not necessarily the focus of today's conversation, unless you want it to be, the kind of development that I understood when I was in graduate school was completely different. It was human development, lifespan human development. So there's a whole chapter on that in my book as well. How did this notion of human development intersect with what economists called international development? And that's a fascinating story we won't probably have much time to go into in this conversation. But I'm glad you asked me the question, because there are different answers to the word development. And even today, if you read any of the newspapers, the current publications out there, people use development in a remarkable variety of ways, though I think the standard definition, if you are a New York Times reader, would be economic development. But if you work in the social sciences or in psychology, development actually means the development of the individual over time. And there are other definitions as well. There's a lot of criticism of the term that you can find in today's academic literature because of these problems of definition.
Yeah. I mean, I think both of these could be really interesting to dive into, economic development and human development. So for context, I spent about 6 weeks with this tribal community in southern India in 2023. And it was, I mean, some of the most interesting and fascinating work that I had seen, where a lot of it was around both human development and economic development. But at that point, I was kind of naive and thought development was kind of, it would be easy. You just kind of fix one thing and then all of a sudden that should naturally bloom into everything else. But it was fascinating how holistic the nonprofits there were working with the communities there. I mean, they focused on transportation, on healthcare, on education, on how learning about addiction and mental health and therapy. And I mean, it was just so. It became so clear to me there that there is no one golden solution. If you fix this, then everything is done. It actually all has to be done together for the benefits in each sector to kind of influence the other ones. So when we talk about economic development, I sometimes have a hard time picturing what this looks like, because when you get to live in a country that has a very robust economy, you don't often have to really think about the nitty-gritty of how did this come to be. You just have to take it for granted. You're like, all right, I got to do this to go get a job. I don't really have to make sense of the entire thing as a whole. But when you work with a community that doesn't necessarily have that kind of those resources or that wealth in that way, where do you start? What is the kind of end vision? What does it mean for a group of people to have a strong economy? And then where do you start in your process?
Well, like your comment a moment ago, we could start in a lot of different places in that last comment you made. It's a legitimate question, and people do start in many different places, especially, I would say, if you're in an academic setting. The people who work in development are very varied, and they usually pick a piece of the puzzle. There are very few people, and this is part of the storyline we will get to in light of the questions you were posing to me before we began today. And that is your example from South India. Are we in Tamil Nadu or thereabouts? So people who have worked with what are local NGOs, non-governmental organizations, of which there are many outstanding ones in India, who work holistically, have both enormous opportunity and enormous challenges, because the opportunity is to really make a difference in people's lives that are tangible. You can't always know what is a tangible difference to an individual. It may mean having more money, but it might mean having another animal. It might mean having another hectare of ground to plow. It might be having more children. It might be sending your children to a school and seeing them progress. So there are a lot of very different consequences to what we call development today. And that's in many ways what makes it a fascinating area, but also, depending on what your specialty is, it means that you're unlikely to, if you were looking at it from a research or social science perspective, you're unlikely to solve the person on the ground's problems because you only have a limited number of tools. You may be a psychologist, you may be a sociologist, an anthropologist, engineer, and you only can act on what where you would add value. I do think education is one of the best areas to act, because in many ways you don't have to know exactly what will happen to the individuals on the other end, but you do know that at least at some level, if you help educate a child, the consequences are likely improved over not having educated that child. So that is, I think, what drew me into education as a focal area. Though education itself is somewhat broad, nonetheless, there are certain key elements of education, such as learning how to read and write and do math, at least the most basic level, which is an important starting place in every country. And yet, in some countries, including in South India, it's very hard to get kids through primary school. And then beyond primary school, for many pieces of the Indian community, but also globally. There are hundreds of millions of kids who don't make it either into school, and many hundreds more who don't make it beyond primary schooling. Or if they do, it's sort of low enough quality that it's hardly distinguished from never having gone to school. Sorry to say, this is what the research shows. So I don't know if that is as focused on your question as you'd like me to be. You can push back on that if you wish.
No, it's totally, I guess what I think a lot of this really brings up, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, because when we think about development, and this has been coming up so often in talking about education for our own country, but I think when altruism often arises, the more connected you feel to a person, the more you feel like, oh, we're on the same side or the same team, the more likely you are to treat them with some level of altruism. Sometimes, and I would love to know your honest kind of opinion on this, but sometimes it feels like when we talk about these more international approaches to, education or developing one's economy, sometimes it can be done with as a means to an end. Like, okay, if I increase your education, then you'll be able to give back to me because I can then, outsource a lot of the work that we don't want to do onto you, and you'll be educated enough so that you can do that. Yeah. How is that the same? Which is why when you talked about human development, I sometimes feel like that's separate from making sure that you're competent enough to do the work that I want you to do. But then how much would you say a lot of the international work kind of falls under that bucket, where we are helping you so that you can then serve us in some ways?
Yeah, I think you've touched on one of the important points in any conversation around development is, what's the purpose of it? Who's getting what? Who's proposing what? What's your leverage point? What's worth investing in that is good for the individual or for the country? It's long been an area of interest of mine, one that I think, to my mind, still is out there. It's something I talk with students about a lot, because it is not often easy to know what your purpose is. What's your underlying purpose? And some of the purpose is defined by the organization. Now I'm coming over to my view on this, is that the organizations often have a mandate. And what organizations am I talking about? All of us citizens of one or another country, or even non-citizens, but located within the borders of a country. If we're talking about education, if we grew up in that country, or whatever country we grow up in, there is always a Ministry of Education that is supposed to be responsible for our well-being. Of course, it's not the only ministry, but it's the ministry most responsible for education, which is often the largest budget of nearly every country in the world. So what are they supposed to do with these funds? They're supposed to develop a curriculum and train teachers to teach that curriculum, and hope that the consequences of this will be good for the country and for the outcomes of individuals, and that the individuals themselves will feel good about their education. So that at one level is what I would call national development. That is, it's based on what nations do, where nations spend money, and where nations think they know what they want in the children that are growing up. Most nations look to other agencies for guidance around international development, even in their national development. And so this is it needs a little bit of time to clarify here. So if I'm a minister of education in India or Uganda or Mexico, I try to do my best to spend the money I've been allotted for spending on children and teachers to help children in building schools, providing electricity, maybe computers, maybe textbooks, whatever it is. And I depend often on both inside and outside information on how to do that best. And so we mentioned the World Bank, but we could also mention other regional organizations for Latin America, for Asia. All the countries of the world are part of either regional or international networks. And this is relevant to our conversation. I'm an academic, and so my job as an academic is to understand, what does the research say about education and development or educational outcomes. So part of my role is trying to look at that research and, as best I can, train students to look at that research, train students who may go back and become ministers of education, which also happens, or certainly involved in the field of education. And where do we go from this? We get further and further away from the individual as we try to apply research, especially regional and international research, to the situation, let's say, in a community among people in southern India, in a particular community. How does a research finding from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, relate to what you were doing in that village with a local nonprofit? And how does that nonprofit get information from the so-called international development community? This is the challenge I'm talking about, and I think it's inherent in this field that there's a tension between trying to understand what it means to be very local and to understand the research and policy conclusions that are supposed to work in that village. The gap is a large one, Gautam, and I think that is what it makes the field so difficult, and makes maybe your experiences, whether in India or anywhere else, so challenging, because you go to a place where maybe USAID had been, or the British or the French, and you say that, and they say, we've had these people in here, we've had consultants in here, they work for years, and yet we still don't have electricity, or we still don't have computers, or our children are still dropping out of school. Whose responsibility is that? And what is the role of, and part of your question to me earlier was, what's the role, let's say, of academics or students or activists in trying to address these challenges which happen among poor communities across the world, and still is happening, even as the absolute poverty rate has fallen. The specific poverty rate has not, even in countries, the so-called developed countries. I wanted to challenge that term also, because you used the word developed countries a little earlier on. I don't believe that there are developed countries. I don't even believe there are developed people. There are people who have experiences of human development. They happen to live in places where there are communities at different levels of I don't want to use the word success, but different levels of competence or successfulness in terms of, let's say, having TVs or bicycles or cars. But to know what development is requires you actually to be there and understand, almost village by village or community by community. I want to be clear, though, I don't think that absolves the development community of doing anything. Quite the contrary. I think it means we have to understand the dilemma of trying to be very local, and also understand the broad sweep of both history and global development that we have learned over the last, well, at least since World War II. That's probably where the academic study of development began.
Yeah. I mean, so much of what I'm hearing you say is this idea that the extremely local approaches to some of these things are not effective in the same tone, these kind of big kind of sweeps from the up, and people have been talking a lot about that also in terms of how making changes or reforms in the American education system, right, where doing something extremely localized in a singular classroom often doesn't have that same level of generalizability to kind of translate over states or different communities. And in the same way, the federal government can't understand what needs to happen at every single level to also make that change at that level. And so the complexity lies somewhere in between.
Yes. Yeah. And by the way, I think that point is important, because it doesn't just apply. That kind of statement, I think, is generalizable around the world. That is, you can't understand by a single claim at 20,000 feet.
Yeah.
And you can't necessarily be very effective if you're only in a village. Somewhere
Yeah.
between the two needs to reside a working knowledge that can make a difference. And some people have been successful, I think, in that. Others have stayed at 20,000 feet, and it works for them. And I might say, if I can just add one sort of important footnote, since we were talking a moment ago, or I was, about national development and the roles of ministers of education, we have a problem in this area called education or educational development, in that the people who are the strongest action leaders are often these ministers of education. They have real budgets, they control real teachers, they get serious amount of money, even if it's not enough by most standards we have. Nonetheless, the way it works in most countries is the minister of education is the least likely to be sustainable in her or his position for more than 2 or 3 years. And they often, if you check their backgrounds, are often not educators by background, nor are they researchers. So the ability to carry forward policies that we think will make a difference becomes more challenging if you have to keep convincing and educating the leadership, which changes very frequently in most countries in the world. It's rare to have anybody who has more than 5 or 10 years of experience. It's not the fault of the minister. It's the way the politics of education works. This is not widely recognized, by the way. So I hope it's understood to be, it's sort of inherent in the system. It's like trying to run a government. If it changes really frequently, it's hard to get the streets clean if you have a very different approach to how they should be cleaned.
Yeah.
Education is much more difficult than cleaning the streets, by the way. Education is a real challenge, and therefore worth spending time on, spending energy, spending money.
I mean, this whole, it's so fascinating. I mean, thinking about change. I mean, okay, and I'm going to posit a very big question, and we can kind of break it into smaller pieces and try to tackle it. But something that I was thinking about and writing, even in what you were sharing, is I'll give you a brief, maybe 3 minutes, just on what I think about this, and then I'd love to know what your thoughts are. But so I grew up in the Bay Area. It's a place that is extremely resource rich. There's a lot of competency. There's a lot of just money in the area. But something that I've been really fascinated to find is that the amount of fear that I find in the people who live in that area about their chances of perhaps losing their money or not being able to sustain their lifestyle is really, really high. And so what you end up having is, even though you have these people who are financially really secure, in theory, feel as if they need to worry as much as someone who may have far, far less money than them. And so what ends up happening is you have these people who end up hoarding resources, not because they're selfish or they're mean, but they genuinely have that fear that I will lose all of this if I don't hoard in the same way. So when we think about development on a larger scale, I feel like so long as this kind of fear exists around, if I don't hoard, then the system will no longer, provide for me. Won't there always be this deep level of inequity where there are certain places that are resource poor, either because of where they are geographically or because of the exploitation? Won't this always kind of be a difference between those with power and those without? And then what are we really trying to do when we say we're trying to help or make changes?
Well, you've asked 2 or 3 questions in that comment.
Sorry.
But I think the first quick comment is that, as you've probably heard with other speakers or learned in other ways, economists will always say your feeling of self-wealth, your feeling of goodness about your situation really depends very much on who your neighbors are. So if you have a car and everybody else is driving a rickshaw, you feel great. If you have a car and the guy next to you has a Cadillac SUV and the other side of you is a Mercedes, something like that, and this is true all over the world, you always feel to agree as sort of a standard economic consideration or observation, I should say. I think the idea that we have, I'm going to drive us back metaphorically back into the education sphere again. We have that in education too, of course. Some universities, if we're at the higher education level, have a stronger brand than others. And some people feel if their kid doesn't get into an Ivy League school in the United States or an IIT in India or the Sorbonne in France, that their children won't make it. And so they spend a huge amount of time, energy, anxiety trying to address those inequalities, even at the top end of the scale. So you have identified, I think, a general comment is that one never has enough, and that cuts across the world. On the other hand, as a person involved in education, I would say that the fact that every country in the world has a Ministry of Education, devotes a substantial budget to educating their children, means that there is a universalist perspective on the value of education. The people who work in what I have been using the term development or economic development, that perspective, have gathered huge amounts of data that suggests that more education generally is better for outcomes of children than less education. I'm not saying that's true in every specific case, and there are plenty of people who don't sort of contribute positively to society who have gone to the best universities. We know that too. But on average, the reason why ministries of education invest in education is they think that there's a social good associated with it. And the reason why parents, for the most part, are, and not everybody, but for the most part, are willing to invest time and energy and even scarce resources into promoting the education of their children is the same. That is, they would like their children to do at least as well as they have done. And if they're very poor, there are examples where very poor people, in fact, do extremely well if they manage to get the educational resources and assets work for them. So, I'll be in a big symposium on the West Coast coming up in San Francisco in a month, and I'll be chairing a symposium on the question of the role of learning in peace. What is that role? And I'm sort of touching on it right now. And the role of learning in peace, I would say, broadly speaking, is that without learning, without a quality of education, the tools you have are very limited for your own social mobility. And what that has meant over the centuries is people who feel like they have to go for other means rather than their own merits to get what they want. And thus, peace is at risk. This is, by the way, not my unique idea. This was part of the Charter of the United Nations. And one reason why literacy has been one of the core pillars of the UN mission in all the different agencies ever since the founding of the UN. So what I'm saying is really what is generally the perspective of those who work in international agencies and even in national ministries. They don't have a real choice. That is what they are mandated to do. I used that word earlier. But getting that mandate, achieving that mandate, is not at all easy, given the resources that are available and the challenges that still exist.
I guess to maybe bring it back in your ideal, if the world was to be perfect in some ways, what would education maybe look like on an international scale? I mean, at least in terms of the relation between those who have more resources to those who don't. Well, can that ever fundamentally be worked with? Do you think?
Well, based on the data the way you posed it. Do more resources automatically mean happier, well-adjusted people who are going to be successful? The data actually is not very strong in that favor. It's kind of surprising after all these years not to be able to say the reverse, right? We'd like to think that spending more money has greater outcomes. Money doesn't seem to be the most important factor globally, but in specific cases, I think there's plenty of evidence to show of different sorts that show that communities do better when they have more resources to pay their teachers, to get textbooks, to put in computers, or to teach in the correct languages for the kids. There's a lot of things we have learned in education. I know some of your speakers in this show have talked about other dimensions of this. I would say one of the jokes that goes around, I say this tongue in cheek, but international agencies do comparative studies across countries. You've probably seen those graphs, and they show a half a dozen or maybe a dozen countries always at the top, and the same group of 50 countries always at the bottom, and the United States somewhere in between, and both complaining that we could be number one if we only had more money, or we could be number if we did this or we did that in our curriculum. But the joke is, that I'd like to tell my students anyway, is that we'd all be top of the class if we could speak Finnish, because Finland is always at the top of the list. What is going on in Finland? And the joke is that, well, they speak Finnish. If we could all learn Finnish, we'd be at the top of the list. And I say that, of course, in jest, but it just goes to show how difficult it is to know what factors will get us, since we aren't going to speak Finnish, what can we do instead? Well, we have a list of at least a dozen things, maybe 2 dozen, depending on who you're talking to. And you could talk about, I know our time is limited and we haven't gotten to many of the questions on your list to me, but just on this score, I think it's important to know that when you look at, and it relates to the early part of our conversation, if your goal is to try to look globally, if you look globally, that some people call that not international development, but global development. If you look globally and you look at you look at Singapore, you look at Finland, you look at Korea, Japan, a few other countries in the Nordic countries who always score highest on these international assessments, you have to ask yourself, are they the happiest people in the world? Are they the richest people in the world? What are they doing right? What are we doing wrong? This is how often the conversation works. I, for one, don't accept that conversation. I think that's an inadequate way of viewing how to understand what I would like development to mean, which is a broad-based sense of effectiveness within your own context. And I realize that sounds too general at one level, but you were asking me in one of your questions that you was on our list to discuss. We may or may not want to spend time on it, but these studies that look at learning across the globe often are highly dependent on what questions are asked and what samples of population are included. And so it's not, to me, surprising at all that you find Finland or Singapore at the top of the list and other countries toward the bottom. I think our measurement tools need adaptation. We've come a long way in that. You were asking me a little bit about that in your preliminary questions. So that's an area I've spent a fair amount of time on. And I do think that that is going to be critical for what I call learning equity moving forward. In fact, my book, which is called Learning as Development, ends with a chapter on learning equity. What do we mean by that? And I'll just say what I mean by that is reducing the gap between the richest and the poorest within countries, not across countries, but within countries, and raising the floor within countries so that you don't have kids who have been to school who can't read a sentence, for example. That should never be the case. How do we get at resolving that? There are people working on those issues. But those who are focused mainly on the global dimension, I think, have less to offer in the reality that we're in now. I think it's an interesting conversation why the Finnish and Singaporeans do very well, but it doesn't solve the problem of education either in Finland or in other countries. What we have to do is break down the problem. In my view, a term that I used a moment ago is very central to the way I operate as an academic, which is, and I did ever since Peace Corps, since you started there, is looking at who is the sample we are talking about. And I mean sample in terms of the population sample. So I'll give you one Morocco anecdote, and that is in collaboration with the National University, going back a long time, we were looking at rural and urban education in Morocco. And what was interesting was that there were two different worlds of those who understood education in Morocco, those who worked in the urban areas and those who worked in the rural areas. And there was really a disconnect, even among people who were researchers, of understanding the vast differences between kids who in very poor environments, who with parents who were illiterate, and kids who were in the wealthier environments with parents who spoke multiple languages, who had many different options in their experiences. You know, a person I should mention in this conversation is I'm blocking it for a moment.
What could be the first letter?
Anyway, I'll come back to it. But the idea that the worlds of there are different worlds out there. It really comes back to our broad conversation that even today, with all the interconnectedness, that it's still difficult to understand what our relative different neighbors live with. That's true. Yeah. It's true in America as it is around the world. And students, I would say, who might be viewing this, have different kinds of opportunities. You had asked me, I think in one of your questions, how do you train people? What's the future of people who want to do this kind of work? People, for example, like yourself, who have strong local background and who are now working in this sphere of, I mean, it's so impressive what you do. And if you were going to work in the same communities in Tamil Nadu, it would require a close understanding of the language, of the customs, of the value systems, of the religion, of the differences in local communities in Tamil Nadu. Not everybody's the same, even if they're in a so-called tribal area in India. There are lots of differences that create problems for teachers. How do teachers, this is sort of something I've been quite interested in over time, how do teachers manage a classroom when they have multiple languages they need to master in order for children to learn well? What role, for example, can technology play? I'm quite interested still in issues around computers and technology and AI. What can we do around technology that can bridge some of these gaps? There is an enormous, I think, upside to work in this area moving forward. And I want to make sure that in our conversation today, I at least say that even though these are challenges, it doesn't mean that by any means that we can't do better than we're doing, and that we shouldn't. We should. And we know a heck of a lot more about the challenges now than we did when I started out nearly 50 years ago. But some things are hard to learn, and they have to be learned oneself.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to jump in here and ask a question, because I feel like there's so many like levers to this, which I find to be really interesting. I guess we started kind of trying to understand from a global organization's perspective, why are they really doing the work that they're doing? And I think that is one half of the conversation. But the other half of the conversation is actually getting into the nitty gritty of like, when certain things are being implemented, how does it work? So each country, for example, has a vastly unique educational system, which is so fascinating. I feel like just if I could just one day travel and just lay out all the different types of systems, that would be so interesting, because each country has, and those systems produce quite different outcomes because of the philosophies that are just embedded into the design of it themselves. So when working with a new country, do you try often working within that system, or implementing a whole new one, or merging a few different ones together? How do you approach that?
Well, that's a great question. And when you use the word you, you're talking about me, but I would also say you, meaning, broadly speaking, people who do education and development.
Yeah.
My own view is has evolved over time. When I was a graduate student long ago, and I mentioned I had been in experimental psychology, which is similar to people today. You've probably heard of the term randomized control trials in social science. People who do RCTs today were doing RCTs back when I was a graduate student. And we made the assumption, this is what used to really, I found at least irritating, but usually rather bewildering, is that my professors would do a study with 20 college sophomores from the area around Ann Arbor, put them in a soundproof booth, and run nonsense syllables into earphones, and try to discover how the memory worked in individuals. That is, they play a set of nonsense syllables, like 20 of them, and ask you to repeat them back. I had to do those experiments when I was a graduate student. And I was irritated because I thought, who cares how college sophomores remember nonsense syllables? So the least relevant piece of data that one can look at. But in those days, they said, well, we want to not be culturally biased. We want to look at what the average human being does. The average meaning college sophomores in the state of Michigan. Of course, that isn't the average of the world, right? There's a pretty big world out there besides Michigan college sophomores. But that was the challenge, and I think today it's still the challenge. So you asked a question of, how would I approach this? It's really a conundrum between trying to understand what people think globally, or maybe even nationally in this country. How do children learn? How do American children learn? I could never answer that question. There's so many varieties of American children, I couldn't begin to. But people will say, America did this, and Finland did that, and Korea did the other thing, and South Africa did something else. I think you have to start as small as you can, to understand the sample at its ground level, if you can afford it. Most people can't afford that. Most ministers don't even get to the village because they can't afford to spend time there. They're too busy worrying about thousands and millions of children in the national school system. So you have what is, and it's not talking about the value systems of individuals. These are problems of size, energy, budget, and so on. I like to say where some of this started, and there are different, and I'm not sure about our time. Are we still okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I like to say, in my book, I tell an anecdote that I learned about this very issue was, where did public education start and how did they think about it? Well, apparently, at least some people think the French started mass public education, and it started around the turn of the century. And there was a famous psychologist that you might know the name, Alfred Binet. There was an intelligence test named after him, much to his upsetness. But he was the most famous psychologist, or one of them in the world. Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist, was one of his students. And Binet was asked a simple question by the Minister of Education in around 1900. And the minister said, look, we're going to put all these kids in school. How do we know who should go to school? We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough classrooms. We don't have enough schools. And he said, well, he said in French, I'll find you, I'll make up a test so we'll know who are the most apt people to do well in school. And so he did that. And of course, it mirrored what he thought were important pieces of information in the French language. A lot of people didn't speak French in France, but and didn't live in urban areas and didn't have elite parents. It turned out that the test he developed became what we then knew later as an intelligence test, which ran into some of the same problems we're talking about now. And that is, what are the kinds of skills that people need in life? And according to Binet, it was a certain set of skills. It worked well in some ways for the French. It kept the wealthy on top and the poor on the bottom, and people in between working, repairing cars and so on. And that's worked around the world as a way, I would say, a meritocratic way of operating. And nonetheless, it has built-in problems in it. And if your goal is learning equity, we have to, and that's the term I use, to say, how, if it turned out as it has, let's take a country like Peru or Guatemala or Mexico, that groups of the population have forever been at the bottom of the pyramid, what I call the bottom of the pyramid. And why is that? You look at the profile of those kids at the bottom of the pyramid, what do you find? You can answer that question. The same is true in Tamil Nadu. You want to answer that question?
No. What is it?
You find kids speaking the local language, not the national language. The national language is controlled by the ministry. The local languages are what people actually speak. And it isn't only language, it's language and culture embedded with one another. But it isn't by chance that very few people escape poverty out of those ethnic poor communities in indigenous populations in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia and in the United States of America and in Europe. So if you were going to join us in the field of education, and we use the term, what kind of leverage do we have? I think you would want to say that one of the most powerful levers we ought to work on is the language disconnect between the poor and the more wealthy. People are working on that issue, but it's over the years, there's been a transformation that I have seen, but still it is not a universal transformation, and it's still very difficult. So you could say, if you were new to the field, you could say, and maybe some people are who are watching this, well, why don't we just teach all kids in their local language? Dr. Wagner, such an easy answer. How come you haven't discovered that? But of course, it's a lot easier said than done. For one thing, we don't have the capability right now because the teachers are generally trained in national languages, not in local languages. We don't have textbooks for many children in local languages, or good ones. We also don't have a pass-through from local languages to national languages, by which I mean the official languages of a country typically. If you go to school in Quechua, but you have to go to secondary school in Spanish, the pathway is much more challenging than for kids who grew up in a Spanish-speaking household. I'm not saying anything new, but these are some of the challenges. These are some of the things we actually know about education that we still haven't found ways of resolving well. Here's an example from my hometown now, my current hometown, and my old hometown in Chicago, but today in Philadelphia. We teach dozens of languages in our schools here in Philly. What do we do? How much money do we spend on transitioning those kids into English-speaking classes? How effective are they? Who are the kids who make it through? You'll still find that it's the exception rather than the rule that those kids do as well. But it isn't only due to language. I don't want to simplify. It also is, there are other things happening in American schools. I'm not here to talk about American schools, but one of the things that is very obvious if you are an international person is that some schools are able to, and I discovered this in some of my own work in China and Japan, but others have too, the ability to control the classroom in East Asian schools is quite different than that in other European countries and in the United States and in parts of the low-income countries of the world, where the teachers have trouble controlling a classroom. They have too many children, or too many children in too many languages, or parents who are unable to give the kind of social structure to their children to believe that education is top of the priority. There are lots of things going on, hence a lot of promise in the area for people willing to put the effort into it.
Yeah. Sorry, so I just wanted to maybe highlight the question, because so when you're working with when we think about all the different systems, I guess, so tying it back to that, do you sometimes overhaul the original system with something completely new that you know to work somewhere else, or does that not happen often?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and you're right. You did ask me that question. I kind of slipped off of it. I don't think there is a contemporary case, where any ministry had the will or interest in completely overturning its education system. Education is extremely political, and the only way you would get that to happen would be if there was a revolution and a new methodology was put in. I think the closest would be in Cuba, and you might say that there was a revolution in Cuba. There was a political revolution in Cuba a long time ago, and they are known to have a relatively strong education system. There are people who question why that is so. That is what has led it to be so. My understanding is they did not turn over the education system. They turned over the political system and the means by which kids could get into school and get good teachers who are well trained, but they didn't overthrow the curriculum itself. And I think, your example earlier, if we come back to it just for a moment, you said, wouldn't it be interesting if you could go around the world and see the diversity of education systems? It's more the cup half full than half empty, in a sense. You find a lot of similarities, not necessarily in classroom organization, but in what ministries around the world want to achieve and parents want to achieve. They do think reading, writing, and math are important. And then beyond that, the various sciences built on top of that, if their kids can stay in school. There's a lot of commonality, but how that plays out in terms of equity issues can be quite different.
Yeah. And the systems themselves, I feel like the value placed on testing, how do you actually navigate that system? Do you have 12 years or 10 years, or when do you take like the quote unquote big test? How is your what is the relationship between how you get into higher education in relation to what is your other education like? And are there other alternatives that connect you to work? And I feel like the system itself can be quite different.
Well, we could have that conversation. Again, half full, half empty. Maybe, I guess I would challenge that a little bit, because I think the way school systems work and actually I can't even think of an exception. The school systems operate not just to foster learning. They operate also as a triage, a social economic triage, like in health, a triage, so that in every country that I know of, there is a way that each step of the educational pathway is built upon the previous step, so that it's very difficult to advance into secondary education and tertiary or higher education without having completed basic education and learning how to read, write, and do math. So for systems that don't have a lot of money, that is, countries that don't have a lot of money, education is their way of trying to channel resources into those like Benet did, who are most likely to succeed. The social inequality of that is very obvious. It's obvious when you look across generations and you find the same communities sending their kids, like the community you mentioned in the west coast of the United States, feeling relatively poor or relatively not wealthy enough. Nonetheless, they all agree that going to a very good university for their children is a universal goal. You find very few families that don't have that as their goal. They clearly understand the merits of that kind of branding. And that's a remarkable general truth out there. This is why I'm saying that the systems, they may look different. They have different, different writing systems. They may use somewhat different curricula. They may believe in child-centered learning. They may believe in group-centered learning, and they may believe in digital tools or AI. But when it comes down to it, what you'll find is what Pierre Bourdieu called the notion of cultural capital, and education being the most important piece of cultural capital, which is the piece that is the potential equalizer across communities, within countries and across countries. If you can make it into Oxford, you've got it made, or into the Sorbonne, or into Harvard, or wherever else. Irrespective of where you came from, you will do well, at least in terms of your options, for the most part, if you are at the very top of that iceberg. But of course, the vast majority will never come close. And it's that issue that I tend to specialize on, which is the bottom of the pyramid, not the top of the pyramid. It's pretty obvious what happens at the top of the pyramid. The options are tremendous. The outcomes are amazing for those who seek it. At the bottom of the pyramid, there are many fewer options. Your chances of getting into high school are much diminished, or even into middle school, and beyond that, nearly impossible. So to my mind, in titling my book, Learning as Development, I make the claim that if you think there is such a thing as development, however you define it, you're not going to get there without learning. And you're not going to get into learning much without these basic skills that some people call now foundational skills or foundational literacy and numeracy. There's just no way you will get there. You can't cheat your way into that system, because the schools, their purpose systemically, coming back to your term, is to actually weed in those students who are likely to do best in the next phase, and weed out those who will be trouble for the teacher, who will be trouble for the country. And what that leads to is a lot of social inequality and economic inequality.
Yeah. I guess there's so many things that I want to ask you, but I think the core of, I guess, what I'm getting at, I'm trying to figure out how to word it, because I think what I do wonder, I think the language example is a really good one, and I can maybe just speak to some of the things that I experienced when I was in India. There is this hyper value of speaking English, where, if you speak, and there's a lot of resources that are poured into it. But often speaking English in many ways is kind of like a status that, okay, I can do this. I've been educated in a certain way. Whether you actually speak it or not in your work is a completely different thing, where there are so many people I met who do not speak English at work, but they speak the language of their state at work. But then they have spent so much time and energy pouring resources into speaking English, which is a skill they don't use, so that they can kind of portray that they have a certain type of education. To me, that seems like a terrible use of resources. But what happens is, I think when you have one dominant culture, especially in a globalized economy, when you have a few dominant cultures that kind of get to state which fields have the most value, what things kind of are paid the most. Like, if you take computer science, for example, I feel like that's an interesting one, where the fact that the field is so highly paid causes this massive rise in the whole world to go study this thing a lot more. Yeah. But the real value that comes from that is only centralized in a few spaces, a few countries. It feels like everyone else just there's a few individuals who might get the value of it, but the country as a whole doesn't.
Right.
And so I feel like even if you worked with schools, the underlying globalized economy is set up in such a way where even if you worked with schools, the inequity could never, it feels like, be slightened, lessened, or right?
Right. No, I think that's a very useful observation. And I've been working on that particular kind of issue for a long time, and that same concept. Here's an example, a concrete example. So we, some years ago, we were doing work on technology, using technology in schools in South Africa, in a poor part of South Africa, the very same issue that you just raised, Gautam, and that is we put local language software together with English software, so they had a choice of which software they wanted to use. And they wouldn't surprise you. They loved, even the kids who didn't speak English loved to use the English language software. They thought, this is really cool. They liked the other two, but English was sort of the premier language that you could get you someplace. We went to the parents and we said, and by the way, the policy in South Africa had changed about 20, 25 years ago to teach local languages in the primary schools. So we thought, given that the national government was promoting primary languages, the kid would gravitate there. They didn't. And we asked the parents, what language would you like your kids to learn to speak? And they generally said English, because they were thinking their kids would do better in the long run with English. And even after sharing with them as best we could, the research that shows that learning in the local language would get them further in the primary school than learning in English, which they had very few resources to really master well. People were convinced that English was the language up and that would go upward. And it's really the point that you were making a moment ago. That is, in spite of the fact that very few of us go to Harvard or to the Sorbonne or to Oxford, somehow our public perception of those as goals, it's like having an SUV in your yard as opposed to the yard next door. Everybody wants the SUV. It's the thing that shines. It's this sparkling jewel. And I think that that is a huge challenge for us in education. And even, and maybe I should take this opportunity to say that the research itself changes over time. And so in the area of this one, in language, the World Bank for years, up until about 15, 20 years ago, insisted that exactly like what we were just saying, that for the global economy demands English. In South Africa, you should learn English, and everybody should learn English, and they refused to support local language. The South African government sort of put their heels in and said, no, we want to get out of this colonial mentality, and we want to teach local languages. And eventually, the researchers did come up with evidence showing that teaching in local languages was better for children's advancement. But now we're actually in a muddier territory, and I can tell you why, and you probably know why. It's because research findings also depend on the context in which we operate. And so what has happened now is with the internet and social media, people actually know what their neighbors have in their backyard and know who's speaking English, and see kids who are South African in rural areas who are actually making it in top flight positions, and they think, I want to be this, and therefore I want to have a direct goal toward it, in spite of the research that shows that you'll do somewhat better learning the local language first. It's very hard to get people to be motivated to learn in local languages in some countries. I'm not saying this is a generalizable finding. There are places where the local culture is very strong, where there's local support, where there are people who understand the importance of maintaining local customs and local traditions. But I think from a researcher's point of view, some of these issues really take time and understanding the sample of the population in order to make a difference. And that's sort of where I would come back on our conversation about education and international development, if that is how or learning and development, is that we do know something about how people learn, what motivates them to learn, what their perceptions of learning are, but we can't force feed them into what we think it might be important to do. And ministries have a hard time doing that as well. And certainly top-down international agencies have an even more difficult time. We do know some things, though. I want to make a plug for research here before we finish. So back about 25, 30 years ago, well, even before that, I'd done work myself in this area, but subsequent to my work, other work had developed. You might have heard of it, called the Early Grade Reading Assessment, EGRA, people call it. And it was championed actually by USAID, among others, World Bank and others. It was an assessment tool, very simple, the way it should have been. And it looked at how much children were learning in school in whatever language they were learning in. And this was back in the 1990s, early 2000s. And the results, and this is really important, I think, to emphasize here, the results were actually, it was the negative results that made a difference. What we found was that in spite of all the additional monies that were being put in by governments into primary schooling and getting more kids into school and training teachers more, the level of learning was far lower than people thought. The levels of literacy and numeracy were far lower. In fact, in many cases, indistinguishable from kids who never went to school. This finding was so shocking, and it was replicated in dozens of countries, that it lit a fire under the sort of, not just the researchers, but also the policymakers. And it really created, I think, a positive revolution in the importance of the quality of learning in classrooms. Now, getting there, it was very difficult. Finding what's missing is easier than finding how to cure it. And so the cure has taken time, and even what I just mentioned a moment ago, some places using local language, some transitioning to international language at a particular period of time, some using methods that are more focused on groups of kids versus more individualized learning versus digital learning. These are all conversations that if you wanted to dive into, you could have people do that. I mean, that's there. But there are many different approaches to improving learning. There's no single approach that's out there, and we don't have to learn Finnish in order to be top of our class.
I mean, I think just in general, this conversation has been so helpful. I mean, starting from the beginning, I think understanding the political levers of what development is, why is that something that we aim towards, what does it actually mean, and then kind of breaking that down into the actual implementations of a lot of these policies and ideas in the local levels, understanding what works, what doesn't work. I mean, these conversations could go on for so long, but I want to say thank you so much for coming on today and sharing all your insights.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I maybe make one final conclusive comment, and that is, while it's true that this finding that kids have a hard time learning in school, it's also true, I think we've been gathering more and more evidence that working at the bottom of the pyramid, trying to push more resources into the kids who are least likely to succeed, will overall raise the average in poor countries. The idea that the top gets the lion's share of the resources to maintain its inequitable superior performance, even if it means getting a few more people into top universities. We should be spending more at those who are most in need. And it's my belief that by doing that, we can raise not only the floor for them, but also the average for the whole country. And that ties back also into my very brief aside into peace and prosperity, that investing in those who most need it is a huge challenge for us because they need more resources and more understanding of where they're coming from. So I want to make sure I make that point. I think this is an optimistic possibility, but it is not easy to achieve in a situation where education resources have been increasingly cut in recent years, and where we need to both not only know more, but also use our resources in a more effective way.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. No, I feel like a lot of these conversations, it's interesting because it brings up all the areas of knowledge which I feel like I lack. One of those being a deep understanding of what economics is, how it works, understanding what money is, and understanding the kind of ways in which it works and what, I guess, economic development looks like in any given area. Because education is so married with the economy that they're not really too, and it's also married with health, and it's and I think as I've gotten to understand education better, it's becoming more clear that it's incomplete unless you're able to develop your understanding in all these other areas as well. And so I feel like maybe later in a year or two, when I can get my understanding of economics better, I'd love to have you back on and to learn more.
Well, let me drop one more name before I finish. The name I was looking for before is a name you probably know. He's an Indian. His name is Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen wrote a book on, it was entitled, actually my book is a little bit modeled on his title. His was Development as Freedom. My book is Learning as Development. And in some ways, these are analogous concepts. I don't want to leave the viewer sort of so influenced in a little bit by, I want to try to reframe one last time. I don't think we're talking about, and nor was Sen, that's S-E-N, talking about economic development uniquely, though he was an economist. He was trying to break free from the economics lens of the World Bank and others, and ministries of education or governments in general, and say that development comes, in his sense, within the self, within the human. And that's what I am trying to say also. So I'd like us to leave it, at least from my perspective, saying, if you only view it as an economic goal, you will repeat Bourdieu's sort of famous cultural capital idea. If you have an idea of social progressiveness and a feel for helping those most in need, you have to take a broader perspective, a human development perspective, rather than uniquely an economic development. So I want to make sure I'm clear on that, and maybe your viewership. It's not the same old economic development as we once read in the New York Times, at least not to many of us.
I mean, and that's fascinating too, to also learn about how theories of development change over time and to see. But this has been so amazing. I'm excited to listen back to this conversation and take more notes and really let some of this simmer. But thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the prodding, the excellent pushing into important areas. So thank you again, both of them.
And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We are slowly reaching the end of season 12, but it's been so amazing having all these conversations. You can find the show on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and on our website, reeducated.org. If you've been enjoying our work so far, you can also support us by joining us on Patreon. This work could not continue without all of your support, so thank you so much. I hope you're having a great week, and as per usual, stay re-educated.